Live from Ljubljana, Slovenia, and the entire world. This is day 2 of the Igor Zabel Award 2020 International Conference. Under the banner, The Entire World is Our World. The International Conference, organized by the Igor Zabel Association for Culture and Theory, in collaboration with Moderna, Galerija, Ljubljana, reconsiders the universal during the era of global capitalism and pandemic, and aims to rethink our common future and the presence of art in the world, in the entire world, that is our world, not yet our world. Speakers, TJ Demos, Boris Groys, Ade Darmawan of ruangrupa, Apolonija Šušteršič, Alberto Toscano, and Alenka Zupancic. We are live at award.igorzabel.org. Alternatively, tune in via Igor Zabel Association YouTube channel or via Igor Zabel Facebook live stream, or alternatively, via eFlux Vimeo channel, or switch them all on and have your own private multi-channel installation in the great indoors. You'll have the chance to participate in the conversation via comments, questions, etc. Do register or sign in for that. Conference theme. The conference reconsiders the questions that concern both human society and the entire planet, thus all of nature, and are in this sense universal. The time of the coronavirus pandemic has accumulated and more clearly exposed various crises: the environmental crisis, the migrant crisis, and the crisis of public systems, especially of healthcare, education, and culture, which all have a common denominator: global capitalism. Times of crises, typically exploited by those who use them to make a profit, give birth to authoritarian regimes and lead to increased violations in universal human rights and the rights of nature. To this list, we could also add the crisis of politics, or more precisely, the crisis of political alternatives capable of drawing up programs that, in view of the above mentioned, must today function universally. And how has the pandemic that has shaken the entire world impacted art and its institutions? What does the entire world mean in these concrete circumstances? How much is this entire world also our world? Throughout the 20th century, many considered that art had to be universal and it had to search for generally valid patterns and abstract art language beyond national borders and cultural differences, beyond the particular. What we have also learned from this period is that particular, hegemonic, imperialistic, and colonialist interests can hide behind the concept of the universal. Today, when the art world is oriented towards geographical and cultural differences and racial, gender, and other particularities, capital has taken over the task of abstracting. Artistic imaginaries follow both, just as we have increasingly more realisms and community-based projects, so the artists engage in the visualization of the dominant abstract forces of capital. Now, in case you missed yesterday, here are some teasers. Let me tease you, and maybe please you. So, Alenka Zupancic talked about the art of surprise, and here are some snippets from what she had to say. We do not live in a worldless world. We are rapidly getting our world, and I think this is something that we would do better to resist. Resist not in the mawkish sense of remaining open to other worlds, nor in the romantic or patronizing sense of being open to strangers and what they can teach us, how they can expand our horizon, but by striving for a different kind of universality, a link or bond, not accepting this new world too quickly just because it is a world. The progressive struggle today is not simply the struggle for the universal, but at least as much for the question, what kind of universal? The alternative is not simply between no world and one or entire world. Later on, she said, we could perhaps say, for example, that what is on display in much of the contemporary socially critical art is not simply this or that social problem, but the fact that I, as the artist, see this problem, that I'm aware of it, that I want to critically engage with it, that I found my way of impressing it upon the public or upon the world of art. I am on display, even if I'm anonymous. This is not at all meant as a remark about artist narcissism or egocentrism, about artist psychology. It is a remark on structure, on objective configuration being structured in this subjective way. In modern conditions, or in the conditions of modern art, it is extremely difficult to put on display something else than one's own subjectivity, one's own cleverness, wit, criticism, imagination, genius even. It is difficult not to be objective instead of subjective, but to create an object. And Boris Groys talked about the universal subject of care, hospital and museum, two institutions of care. And this is how he closed. If we speak about universality, we have to speak about the universal subject. Can a subject be a universal subject? The subject is constituted by requirements that are addressed to it. The universal subject of the Christian tradition was constituted by the universal requirement to fear God and fulfill His will. Today, we think that a subject is primarily not a soul, but a body. And the bodies are always specific, particular, male or female, white and black, etc. These bodies have different identities, different desires, and different positions in the social whole. And thus, the society requires different things from their subjects. However, there is a universal requirement concerning all the bodies. They should be healthy because their health is the general precondition for their ability to fulfill all the other requirements. This universal requirement constitutes a universal subject. It is the subject of self-care that is responsible for the protection of its own bodies, natural and artistic ones. And to round off my tease that might please, Alberto Toscano talked about quantities of the past, photography in the aftermath of capital. And I'll just hashtag my way through keywords now. Anthropocene without anthropos, depopulation, landscape photography, documentary abstraction, living labor, dead labor, erasure, extraction, exploitation, extinction. How to represent capital, capitalism, endgame, apocalypse, extinction. Labor as resurrection. Dead labor, humans as extras, surplus. Machinery landscapes versus manufactured landscapes. Ruin porn. Photography arrives after the event of apocalypse. Hashtags. And he concludes, there is a clear sense that photography has arrived after the event to record what remains of the event or what can be reconstructed from evidence that an event of significance or import has taken place. Essentially, this is a photography of the event as aftermath, and as such, it tends to stress the ineluctability of the recent past through the melancholic allure of photographic stillness. The necessary lateness of the photograph, the late photograph in its elegiac and mournful modes, not only tends to remove the body from the picture, but also identifies the political, allegorically, with the ruin and the remnant. For more, do visit our channels and look into what our speakers had to say. This is day 2, and the program of day 2 is as follows. This is the premise, this is the promise, on the relation between the particular and concrete and the universal in the field of contemporary art. Apolonija Šušteršič, Becoming Local, Ade Darmawan of Ruangrupa, and T.J. Demos, Radical Futurisms, Worlds After the End of the World. A reminder, we are still live at award.igorzabel.org, alternatively via Igor Zabel YouTube channel or via Igor Zabel Facebook live stream, or alternatively via eFlux Vimeo channel. Well versed in the multiverse. Register or sign in, and we'll keep an eye on your comments and questions. Our speakers need no introduction. What a formula. And yet, if we are to break the cycle of the eternal present, the everlasting now or nowness, open up or leave it up to posteriority or futurity, an introduction does seem in order. Apolonija Šušteršič, becoming local. Architect and artist Apolonija Šušteršič graduated from the Faculty of Architecture in Ljubljana and completed her postgraduate studies in art at the Rijksakademie in Amsterdam. She worked as a professor and the head of the monumental department. What a phrase, monumental department. Department of Public Art at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm from 2003 until 2008. She completed her PhD at the Malmö Art Academy of Lund University in Sweden in 2013. She has been a professor at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts since 2014. Šušteršič develops transdisciplinary and participatory projects for and within the public space. The following are some of her works: Home Design Service, Casco Projects, Utrecht, 2001, Garden Service with Maaike Schalk, Edinburgh International Festival, 2007, Sunset Cinema with Bik van der Pol, Luxembourg, 2008, Community Pavilion Hoestad, Bochum, 2011, and Neighbors and Citizens, Gävle, 2015. She has exhibited extensively, including at Moderna Museet in Stockholm, the Berlin Biennial 3, Moderna Galerija Ljubljana, Generali Foundation in Vienna, the Tirana Biennale 3, Mucha in Antwerp, and the 12th Venice Biennial of Architecture. Apolonija, take it away.
Thank you, Dražen. Thank you for this invitation. It's a huge honor to be on a panel like this with such people around me. However, I feel extremely odd sitting in my space talking to the computer. I hope there is somebody on this other side somewhere listening to something. I would also like to thank to the speakers yesterday, and I think the discussion could be more developed, but in these circumstances, it's just simply very, very difficult. I'm gonna talk about my work and not theorizing too much, or if I'm theorizing from my own experience and practice. I will be presenting two projects. First, I will talk about one that title is Becoming Local, and the other is further on are two projects that I have finished already. Anyhow, I'm not gonna go about COVID again, but I just found these photographs quite amusing, and the facts and speculations around COVID are making me quite depressed. So I thought it's important to think about extending on your personal imagination and look at the subject in a different way. And that's what I'm interested in anyhow, as well in my work. Becoming local, first of all, the sketch of this project that I started to work on during COVID, of course, but somehow the idea is following me for already some time. I decided to kind of create a project that would be based on certain exercises of learning history, learning language, and learning culture, and all in a relationship to Ammerud, where I live at this moment. Just under 13,200 people were granted Norwegian citizenship in 2019, an increase of 3,000 compared to the year before. The majority of the new Norwegian nationals last year came from countries in Asia and Africa, according to newly released figures from the Norwegian Directorate of Immigration. I'm born in Slovenia. I grew up in a social federal republic of Yugoslavia, but then spending 15 years in Holland and another 13 years all around the world trying to connect with people who I can share my interest with, my passion for thinking the world differently, questioning established systems, believing in art as a context where we can expand on new imaginaries. I guess I'm one of the few privileged who have been invited to Norway to take a position within a high school education. I have been running the program MFA Art and Public Space, as it has been mentioned, until up now, until July. However, I would be seen as not Norwegian, a foreigner, who by now speaks very poor Scandinavian and knows very little about life in Norway. The last 3 years, I'm living in Oslo, more precisely in Ammerud, where I moved a year ago. Am I becoming local? Am I on the way to become local? Who is local, actually? Or when are we local? How to become local? Is anybody local at all? The question of becoming local is following my practice for the last 20 years, as I'm working internationally on projects related to the local context with local actors who might not be understood as local at all. At this moment, this question became part of the hidden agenda of integration politics, whose timetable is very strict and surely not related to particular cases. As being the newcomers, we can only answer within the individual situation with arguments based on not knowing the language, not knowing the culture, the place, the history. Ammerud is one of the first suburban neighborhoods built in Oslo in the late 60s, providing homes for about 7,000 people as a result of Norwegian social politics within forming of a modern social state after the Second World War. Most of Ammerud has been built by Oslo Bolig og Sparelag, Oslo Housing and Saving Society. However, the radical urban layout and architectural concept was designed by Håkan Mjelve and Per Norseng. People living in Ammerud today come from very many parts of the world. It's actually 151 nationalities that lives in such a small place as Ammerud, and create an interesting international community that I would call metropolitan suburbia. A place is a world in small, and its cultural, social, and political variety is rich. In all, it has a potential to assemble the knowledge of the world incomplete, in fact. The project that I'm sort of developing or starting to develop is suggesting to mobilize the multicultural potential of the place in order to redefine and challenge the mellow preconception of suburban living. Through this project, I'm hoping to explore the idea of alteration, reopening, and reevaluation of contemporary suburbia, introducing the concept of becoming local, questioning the universality of integration processes, and asking questions of history, language, and culture again. to get an idea of how I'm working with projects, I will now briefly introduce 2 projects because I can't talk about them in details. However, I would love to, because they are usually long projects and creates many, many stories. And they are very sort of stuck in my life and becomes part of my life, of course. This is Neighbors and Citizens. I think Dražen just finished with that one that I started in 2015 in a very, maybe a bit strange place, which is called Gävle in Sweden. It's 2 hours away north from Stockholm. I was invited by Gävle Konstcentrum, which is a place that has been in kind of perpetual decay since I came, or since I visited them, that I hope is now much more stabilized. Anyhow, they asked me to look into the area around the new stadium. It was an invitation for a public art project. And they have, of course, as usual, a certain agenda behind it. But as usual, I'm not very eager to obey. What I was interested in Gävlehof was a site as a meeting place, and not only for sport professionals and sport lovers coming from Gävle and the surrounding, but to mainly see the site as a suburban binding element in a growing city process. Although Gävlehof seems like woods and roads surrounds it, it is not located in an isolated location. Namely, it is situated in between 2 relatively big neighborhoods built in the 60s that together provide home for about 16,000 people. That's Sätra and Stigslund. And of course, there are 2 very different neighborhoods built at the same time. One is very Swedish, the other one is very international. In this project, I'm focusing on the subject of the neighbor and the role of the citizen, using Gävlehof ground as a meeting place. The 3 neighboring elementary schools, Stora Sätraskolan, Stickskola, and Prolympia, became my cooperation partners in the project. Together, we have been discussing the history and the future of our society in general, but also the future and the just past in the city itself. The outcome of this long process of investigations, meetings, talks, walks, and workshops are represented finally within the 3 final urban elements, each related to a very specific local story. That is Apple Tree Orchard, Sand Pit, Ice Skating Rink, and Meeting Bench, as well as signing the Apple Orchard Agreement between the 3 schools, who agreed to cooperate further on the project, organizing an event every year on September 25th, inaugurating the Apple Day as we decided together. Well, obviously, the apple trees became the main subject of our project after we met Sylve Rolandsson, pomologist and an activist fighting for the legendary apple tree in Sofiaparken in Gävle. You can see Sylve on the picture, the first picture on the panel, having a lecture to the students about trees, of course, about apple trees. The tree was recognized as the tree with the bigger crown in the world, the apple tree in Sofiaparken, which is in center of Gävle. And that tree was under stake, namely the developer who bought the ground from the city wanted to cut the tree. And there was a group of people who were fighting for keeping the tree. No matter how the tree was protected, even got a special protection from European law side, then the tree got cut down. So we decided together with Sylve that we are going to graft that apple tree in our project, in our orchard, and to make the tree living on and remind everybody of it on September 25th on our Apple Day every year. The next project was a shorter project, namely Neighbors and Citizens is still going on because we are growing the tree, and there are 3 trees actually grafted, and they are going to be planted next year, and along the way I'm making a movie about that. The next project is a shorter project that I have done in Timișoara last year for Timișoara Biennial. It's a project that I wanted to sort of develop through the methodology I have been using 20 years ago when developing a project in Stockholm. A suggestion for the day was called the project in Stockholm that I've done in 2000 for the exhibition What If? Art on the Verge of Architecture and Design at Moderna Museet in Stockholm. And at that time, I was investigating the city of Stockholm and its current very, very hot issue related to housing problem and the segregation of the city. With an attempt to recontextualize the work in Timișoara, I began my research in the city. I met with several very interesting people and had fantastic conversations. And my question to them was, what is, of course, your suggestion for the day? What is happening in the city? What can you tell me about it? So eventually I found out that the big issue is air pollution. And we decided to join forces and do a project together with Anna Kuhn, Livia Kologi, and Viktor Dragoš. We named ourselves a group Zephyr and developed a campaign for better air, environmental campaign in the frame of the biennial. The group responsible for this project has kind of developed various public platforms to create the awareness and encourage the citizens of Timișoara to join the campaign. And the first thing was that we created, we organized a roundtable discussion in the town hall of Timișoara with, well, on one hand, polluters, and on the other hand, the activists, environmental activists, doctors, and others who were responsible also for the policy, environmental policy in Timișoara. Out of that conference, we built up an installation in Tram Museum, collected lots of data and information, working together with Radu Montișan, who has developed an independent measure system for air pollution measuring. And we were displaying that digitally on the monitor. I don't have that picture in here. Further on, we were making a poster, illegal poster basically, as you see, gluing it on next to the political campaign. They had elections last year in Timișoara, in Romania, or in Timișoara, and running the education programs, as well as at the end up with the Forum Theater performance in Basca Theater, where we kind of collected what we learned through the process of research and campaign, and instigated and kind of provoked public to get engaged through the Forum Theater form. Yes, and then, okay, this is my conclusion here. At the end of my monologue for today, I would like to finish it with how I began, I guess, the idea of becoming local, which I was hoping to explain through my projects. The becoming is obviously a process, as Nietzsche would say, but I guess we have experienced it ourselves as well. Meaning, in relation to the local, it is not a fixed state of being, it is in a flow, in transformation, in the process of continuous change. I'm local in each of these projects that I presented to you. It is based on my experience of people and places, my dedication to investigation of specific subject arising from that specific situation. Nothing to me in these projects is actually general. Everything is specific and it's related to the context. And as I would learn from my students who introduced me to Taya Selassie, Afropolitan writer, much read by the young generation in the last years, I would say, who would claim that we might not be local to only one place, but several. We might think beyond nationality, replacing the language of nationality with the language of locality, to shift our focus to where real life occurs, where culture exists in community and community exists in its context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Apolonija, for that insightful talk. I'll see you in a bit later. Next up, Ade Darmawan of Ruangrupa, art collective based in Jakarta, Indonesia, and currently curator of Documenta 15 in Kassel. Jakarta-based collective Ruangrupa, established in 2000, is a non-profit organization that supports the idea of art within the urban context by involving artists as well as people from other disciplines such as social sciences, politics, technology, and media to provide critical observations and views on Indonesian urban contemporary issues. In 2018, Ruangrupa co-initiated Good School, a contemporary art collective and ecosystem studies. Good School is a public learning space established to practice an expanded understanding of collective values such as equality, sharing, solidarity, friendship, and togetherness. As an artistic collective, Ruangrupa have been involved in many collaborative and exchange projects, including participation in large exhibitions such as the Gwangju Biennale in 2002 and 2018, the Istanbul Biennial in 2005, the Asia-Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art in Brisbane, 2012, the Singapore Biennial, 2011, the Sao Paulo Biennial, 2014, the Aichi Triennale in Nagoya in 2016, and Cosmopolis at Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2017. In 2016, Ruangrupa curated Trans Action, Sansbeek 2016 in Arnhem in the Netherlands. Most recently, Ruangrupa have been selected as the artistic director of Documenta 15 Kassel 2022. Ade, take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, like Apolonija said, it's been weird always, like talking to people that we cannot see, and also that we basically seeing ourselves in the monitor. Yeah, I would like to talk about yeah, how we can see the pictures that I share. Talking about, I think directly towards the Lumbung that we work on, which is you might maybe recognize it from what we've been doing in towards Documenta, but actually this is not a theme, or this is not a topic that a subject that in the center and everything's around it is actually react to it. For us, this is a lot of things to do with the values, with the principles, and then also the method, or like the way of working. We started like 20 years ago. I mean, like we met each other like mid 90s, and we started like from small house, working together, spending time together, as well as a lot of students as well. Really started from sharing our space and time together. So this is actually what we've been talking about, how we can share some time and space. We slowly grew the space into something that like really relate to also not only ourselves, but also slowly having really attachment or engagement with the surroundings, with the neighbors, and so on. And our space, our home, we grew up together with we grew together with the neighbors as well. And the house, or like this living room, is become sort of a space that we can share usually in a circle without really time spent, and then also very organic, less power structure, and so on, and like really can have like different function. Like Lumbung, as Lumbung is actually a rice barn, which is in agraric in Indonesia. It's not only to store the harvest, but also the seeds. So there is a sustainability ideas in it, and also there's idea of a crisis, because that's actually where the collective governance will decide what to do with that when the crisis come. And also in the same time, it's actually about the surplus. You know, like you have a self-limitation, and then you define yourself what is a surplus, and then you store it, and then you can actually govern together. But in this case, of course, there's no seeds, or there is no rice in it, but it's more something that tangible and intangible, you know, like time, energy, ideas, and so on. So we grew with the ideas as not as a private ownership. Ideas is really a shareable, also space and time. Like Dragan just mentioned, yes, we setting up. After several times we move, and then we work a lot also with other collectives in Jakarta and also in other space in Indonesia. We decide to do a collective, which is also part of our sustainability of ideas, like how to work, and also how to sustain these practices. And it's like the sort of like the only method that we are thinking is actually making it like more systematic in a way, and school as regeneration knowledge. It's not like a school of formal. It's collective studies. So we gather people like different collectives from many places, from different islands as well, who would like to work or like to develop a collaborative or collective practices. Like now, for example, we have 3 years already running this program, and we have now like 22 or 23 collectives from different islands doing online, and like develop all a project together. And again, about the surplus, you know, like in the beginning, it was quite a like I think it needs us, even we do it like organically, this collective sharing resources, ideas since the beginning. But like I think the last 5 years, we really struggle how to sustain this practice, and then we are thinking about making this Lumbung more formal and more I think more systematic in a way, not only intangible but also tangible, especially like a space and money. So it needs like a several years that finally we have like really very transparent as well. We have like quite a number of collectives coming together. So we sort of like develop these diagrams that you saw. Like there's a sort of like, I mean, like trying to explain it much better, I think. So that's why we developed this diagram. That's more or less like there's one called self-sustainability, which is experimentation of our economic model. And then there is artistic, which is actually gathering a lot of ideas, practices of different collectives. You can see there's many organization and space as well being together. And then the other one is actually sort of like the knowledge harvest, and then also regenerated towards this platform of collective studies. And these three govern together in we call it Lumbung, but govern together in a majelis, which is assembly, and then we do it like every month. Like can be like 50, 60 people come together and then decide together what to do with all the resources, programs, ideas, monies, and so on. Like everyone is actually can oversee each other's even bank account. So it's like everyone who need a support can actually get from other resources, and also with the ideas. So so it's not only about, there's a lot of relation in this Lumbung practice. Of course, it's not only collective practice, but also a collective governance, economic model, which is also, still I think we're experimenting. Like we don't know it's going to work or not, but so far, even during the COVID, it's actually even even relevant because we can taking care of each other more precisely. There's a lot of harvest, which is also coming not only visually, but knowledge as well. And then also there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of generosity. There's a lot of sufficiency, independency also in this practice. So this is what we try to bring to the Documenta. So it's not a theme. It's actually like a way of working. We're not really interested, of course, in translation modes. It will be super interesting to translate one practice into other places or to other contexts. But that's, I think, not the only one that we're interested. But we're interested also to build a certain platform with this Lumbung concept, with the different model or practices that have a similar values, which is also practicing, struggling, attempting, speculating in different contexts. We try to learn each other from each other, and then that's why we have like a two stream. Like one stream is actually like Lumbung making platform, which is we the aim is actually not only Documenta 2022, but it's really go beyond the 2022. And then the 2022 itself is sort of like a harvest. We imagine it's actually like a harvest a festival, which is traditionally Lumbung is very there's a celebration of harvesting, like when the farmers is actually bringing their harvest to store in the in Lumbung, and that's including a lot of relation, very performative, very sonic as well, very spatial and visual, architectural also in the same time. So so this is sort of like what we imagine in 2022. So there's two things which is going to be sort of like colliding. And in terms of the event itself, with this Lumbung, it's also something to do with we call it the Lumbung Interlocal, because it's not only us, but also different locals, and also we see Kassel also as a local. So we develop also called Ruru House in Kassel, which is going to be a home for Kassel Lumbung, which is really related, connected to Kassel Collective or Initiative. And this is also, I think, one can see as one can call it a curatorial method, but that's how we work. I think, like maybe in the beginning, I started with the space, and that's how we work. It's very our sensors, our body is actually attached, or like our rather sensorical and also sensitivity is actually coming from working in the space by spending time with people, spending time with the stories around, and so on. So we cannot work without that, you know. So this is also the way that we we started already since mid of this year in Kassel, and we did it also in Sonsbeek actually 2016 with the Ruru House, but only like 1 year before the actual event. So really we develop a space from scratch, and working with the people around, not only artists, but also friends, neighbors, new friends, new neighbors, and so on. And from there, we develop our ideas on sensitivity also on the space, on the issues, and so on. Yeah, so this is just actually next to the Friedrichianum. It's really different. Like we started so small. This is like a big space for us. It's a big scale, and we already gathering also. This is just like before the winter, so like people can still gather. Like we cannot do it anymore right now. So this is kind of like our sensitivity towards the working, and also how we define this lumbung. Not to see it lumbung as something that will dominate or like will apply to every places in the world, but I think it's more interesting to have a conversation between a different contexts and also different models. So we imagine that it's going to be a collection of models or practices, attempt and speculation of how people actually struggles, and also trying to find their locally anchored model. And in terms of Kassel itself or the Documenta, I mean, like we really try to see it not to be dominated or not to be extracted or exploited by such a monstrous events, which is also have a big myth, but really seeing us also as a local, as a part of resources, how we see it, like what's the need of Documenta, but also in the same time, what's the need of the world ecosystem, how to bring that conversation actually in really in a mutual way, and also in equal way, not to only extract, bring and chop artworks from all over the world or practices from all over the world and then put it in one place called Documenta or Kassel, but also the question is actually, which is what we are doing right now, can it be also cycle back to the local ecosystem? So what we see, that's how like really a different research that we try to navigate. Not only seeing the artworks or like really as a singular modes or practice or objects, but like really how we can see it also as a part of the larger ecosystem, and not to chop it and extracting it, because there's a lot of reduction practices also in curatorial or like in exhibition making, that we try to also trying to break it, or trying to explore it and how those, maybe this is, can it be like a translation? Can we go back to a contribution, for example? Can it be a representational replaced by, I cannot really find the word other than occupation. Can we replace that? Maybe occupation is a bit too strong. But like being representational, I think it's a lot of reduction, a lot of extraction modes in itself, but how it can actually cycle back. How the event, such as Documenta, also think about the other locals, about the other ecosystems, and then also like trying to put that the cycle system rather than just like a one big magnetic event that can like really absorbs in a very exploitative mode, which is many exhibition or events is actually doing it. So this is sort of like this translation and Lumbung is sort of like two things that we work on also, not only for Kassel, but also how to have this relation with other locals as well, rather than illustrating or narrating in such a way, but like can it like really in a economical or financial and also aesthetics mode can be like really having this conversation instead of like thinking like a big scale exhibition. What we are thinking is actually small but many, like rather than to think big, like there's a lot of question to us, like how are you going to do it at this big scale, but we never really see this as a big, I mean, like we that's how we think also in our practice, like it's more about working with the different diverse units and then make sure that it's in conversation. The harmony, the composition, and so on, having a mutual and also in the same time critical relation rather than just like one sort of like entity dominate and exploit the others. I think that's it for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ade. I'll see you in a little bit. Next up, T.J. Demos, Radical Futurism's Worlds After the End of the World, Insurgent Universality, Solidarity, and Worlds to Come. T.J. Demos is the Patricia and Roland Rebelli Endowed Chair in Art History in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at University of California, Santa Cruz, and founding director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. Demos is the author of numerous books, including Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, Sternberg Press, 2017, Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology, also Sternberg, 2016, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis, Duke University Press, 2013, winner of the College Art Association's 2014 Frank Jewett Mather Award, and Return to the Post-Colony, Specters of Colonialism in Contemporary Art, Sternberg Press, 2013. Demos co-curated Rights of Nature, Art and Ecology in the Americas at Nottingham Contemporary in January 2015, and organized Specters, a Cinepolitics of Haunting at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid in 2014. During 2019 to 21, with the Center for Creative Ecologies and as a research project, art exhibition and book project dedicated to the questions, what comes after the end of the world, and how can we cultivate futures of social justice within capitalist ruins? His new book, Beyond the World's End, Arts of Living at the Crossing, was recently released by Duke University Press. TJ, take it away.
Hi, I'm TJ Demos, and I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the Entire World as Our World conference for the invitation to speak. It's a real pleasure to be here, at least over Zoom. And I'd like to thank Zdenka Badovinac and Adela Železnik in particular, and all the organizers for the work they've done on the conference. My talk discusses current artistic modelings of radical futurisms and worlds to come that refuse surrender to capitalist realism, and where radical imagination meets radical praxis in the material forces of solidarity, the political form of collective belonging that I see as more than ever necessary today in the collective battles against international fascisms and global neoliberalisms, but which also involves a necessary act, I argue, of disbelonging to overcome the particularisms of essentialist identity. How can solidarity operate anew on that basis? Thank you, and over to my talk. With her compelling contribution to indigenous futurism, Thurza Jean Cuthand's Reclamation, 2018, documents what's to come. Premised upon a mass settler exodus to Mars, the short video portrays a broken, abandoned Earth left to indigenous peoples who, freed of extractive devastation, toxic racism, repressive heteronormativity, and the endless wars and violence of capitalist property relations, subsequently begin the work of post-colonial environmental restoration. Delivered through familiar documentary tropes, the piece showcases interviewees discussing their newfound lives, with contextualizing footage of dystopian landscapes presented in the evidentiary mode, with a handheld camera's reality effects. Its futurism unleashes radical formal possibilities in both decolonizing time, reversing conventional documentaries' ties to pastness, projecting the that which has been into the that's to come, and generating forces of creation beyond the mimetic doubling of reified and colonial realities. It thereby lays an explosive charge in the present through performative imagination, rendering the future as disruption that much more probable. The stakes are indeed enormous. We're caught in a situation in which time has been colonized, racialized, and economized, generating what Black Quantum Futurism, the Afrofuturist collective based in Philadelphia, term the temporal ghettos of racial capitalism, where the master's clockwork universe unevenly distributes spatio-temporal mobility, agency, and determination. Just as material inequality reigns, we also succumb to an endless present of capitalism's calculative machinery, seemingly rendering resistance pointless. Time operationalized as such recalls what Jasper Puar terms prehensive futurity, a chronology that inevitabilizes a desired unfolding. We cannot get out of the present because we're tethered to the desired future. Past, present, and future feel somewhat futile as descriptions of temporal distinctions. Conventional documentary tends to reify that time trap. Cuthand's Reclamation, a decolonization of time as much as of space, poignantly contests dominant approaches to time, including techno-libertarianism's prehensive futurity and its colonization of land, the economy, and the infosphere of communications as much as of temporality. It's as if its vision of what's to come is a foregone conclusion, as when billionaire tech entrepreneur Elon Musk, who, in response to charges of complicity in a 2019 anti-democratic political takeover in Bolivia, in part to secure lithium reserves for global markets, including for his own Tesla cars and SpaceX project, tweeted, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." Performing the hegemonic futurity to which we're all tethered, Musk pushes extractive colonial capitalism into any and all territories, including outer space, as well as into infinity. Thankfully, that vision was rejected in the recent Bolivian elections. But Musk's futurity entails destroying the lands, waters, and life chances of frontline communities worldwide, producing a growing class of the indebted, vulnerable, and disenfranchised, subjected to all manner of police violence, incarceration, and growing deaths of despair, on top of mounting climate disasters, existential insecurity, and pandemic emergency. Given the resulting desperation, our forlorn present has triggered blunt expressions of time resistance, like Alicia Wormsley's "There Are Black People in the Future," placed recently in halting all caps on black billboard in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the US, as well as on various artistic objects, sculptural pieces, and installations and films. Wormsley's revolt against being defutured, elaborated in a proleptic tense of the present impending, a chronopolitics of prefiguration, resonates with the ongoing battles over public monuments and their removals in the US and worldwide. These highlight the otherwise suppressed violence of colonialism and slavery and their aftermath, past and present conflicts over heritage, inextricable from the very social production of the future, which also index the stakes of documentary today. Indeed, who has the right to produce the future? One modeling is Black Quantum Futurism's documentary Chronopolitics, which materialize video assemblages and photomontages that unleash the force of radical reversibility. They target time zones that keep racialized bodies locked in oppressive cells, fortified by all manner of temporal encasements, unchanging pasts, presences of indolence and criminality, defutured voids. From these, they break out, as with their 2019 video Black Space Agency training video. Overlapping images blur into illegibility, shapes mirror and mutate, mimicking soundscapes filled with echoes and reverberations, all emanating from a deep psychic space of traumatic collective memory in the afterlife of slavery, in Saidiya Hartman's words, and in the recent pasts of housing segregation. With Black Space Agency, and you can see these videos through the links that I show in the presentation. With Black Space Agency and assorted collages, Black Quantum Futurism graphs the techno-optimism of past space travel, dramatized in astronaut iconography and mirrored helmets reflecting black faces, onto newspaper clips reporting unfulfilled housing justice dreams, resonating with the goals of Black Quantum Futurism's Community Future Labs in North Philadelphia, where member Rashida Phillips works as a housing rights lawyer. Their cultivation of space agency is juridico-political and geographical as much as aesthetic and temporal. Indeed, the challenge is how to constellate their pulsating lights and sounds to gain the future they want, ripped from the contradictions of racialized inequalities in resource allocation. As their video quotes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as valid today as it was in 1966. There's a striking absurdity in committing billions to reach the moon, where no people live, while the densely populated slums are allocated minuscule appropriations. Those uneven geographies are also upended in Cuthand's reclamation, resonating with the resounding world historical project of decolonization, as demanded by indigenous formations like Idle No More, and more recently, that's in Canada, and more recently the Red Nation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the States. For them, decolonization represents the abolition of dominant economic arrangements and socio-political systems organized around extraction and exploitation, bringing to an end more than 500 years of colonial history and making way for a future collective emancipation. The video's performative power constructs its subjective viewership, an emancipated people to come on land evacuated of oppressors, which bears on how solidarity might operate today, particularly in settler colonial territories like North America, including in documentary practice. Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have argued that non-native solidarity with indigenous emancipation must avoid what they term settler moves to innocence, or goodwill ally gestures that practice the metaphorization of decolonization by denying its essential meaning, the return of land and sovereignty to indigenous peoples. Ultimately, for Tuck and Wang, settler accomplices can only accept in what they call an ethic of incommensurability when it comes to solidarity, relinquishing settler futurity, abandoning the hope that settlers may one day be commensurable to native peoples, which in turn requires an understanding of uncommonality that coalesces coalition politics. Accepting uncommonality leaves us recourse to alternatives like those presented in Radical Black Praxis, dedicated to the undercommons and a permanent fugitivity, as elaborated by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, where the refusal of property and possession of land as much as conventional subjectivities is the ethical truth of emancipated social experience and the only possible basis for decolonial solidarity. That's exactly what Cuthand's radical futurism offers, in some ways, to non-Indigenous viewers via documentary form, a subjective non-place, dispossession and permanent fugitivity, and this precisely because the decolonized what's to come is devoid of settler colonialism's oppressive subjects. With the video, non-Indigenous viewers experience their own disappearance, their own twilight. They become accomplices in the abolishing of whiteness as a structure of racial division and colonial oppression. That said, one might argue conversely that demetaphorizing decolonization shouldn't end in the uncoalescing of coalition politics, but rather reveal new forms of solidarity on that basis. Indeed, there's an urgent need for such alliances now more than ever, given present hyper-partisanship, social media atomization, and ethno-nationalist reaction, in order to build collective power to disrupt the constancy of colonial capitalist violence that harms us all, if differentially, sociopolitically and economically. Writing from yet another radical indigenous perspective, Nick Estes of the Red Nation argues that indigenous futurity is and must be universal. It isn't just for indigenous people, he writes, it's essential for the very existence of life on the planet. What's required is a social revolution, he argues, that turns back the forces of destruction, uniting indigenous and non-indigenous people in common struggle against capitalism and colonialism alike. Such a position resonates with recent approaches to reinventing a radical universality, such as Max Tumba's book Insurgent Universality, where he argues that solidarity, understood politically, begins with the renunciation of one's particular identity. It begins as a practice of disbelonging to a specific social position and to a given social order. And insurgent universality designates a universality from below, a democratic excess with a necessarily empty center. It's a project always necessarily incomplete, but a necessary step beyond the limits of particularism. Certainly there's some differences here between Nick Estes's indigenous decolonial position and identity claims and Tomba's solidarity as a mode of disbelonging. But I think there's arguably an important element here where in order for universality to take place at all, it has to involve some kind of transformative, translational disbelonging to bring difference together. This is also argued in Mistaken Identity by Asad Haider, for whom political emancipation to be universal requires a kind of disidentification, similar to Tomba. And he's borrowing from, in part, Judith Butler, who argues that no social movement can, in fact, enjoy its status as an open-ended democratic political articulation without presuming and operationalizing the negativity at the heart of identity. So this is a kind of approach to solidarity and universality from below that is post-identity politics. Instead of uncoalescing alliances of difference, another option still is unifying in support of their abolition, which documentary might also abet. At this speculative limit is Infinity Minus Infinity, the Autolith Group's 2019 film linking racial capitalism with the colonial genocide perpetuated during the Anthropocene's beginnings in the 16th century conquest of the Americas. Their genealogy builds further to the hostile environment of recent British immigration policy, especially that affecting the Windrush generation of migrants, living both in the afterlife of slavery and in the post-colonial wake of empire. The Windrush generation referring to those arriving in the United Kingdom from the Caribbean islands between 1948 and 1971, only to have their residency status questioned and even rejected decades later by recent British xenophobic migration policies. The film's cinematic allegory traces these complex historical networks as mediated by performance, dance, and recital, and historical truth-telling spoken by figures who appear, as on the screen, as trans-temporal deities. With Denise Ferreira da Silva, the artists speculate about a blackness beyond capture, an infinity beyond infinity, in place of the subjectivity long denied to those of African diaspora by European Enlightenment modernity. Documentary is consequently keyed to a future indeterminate, to the ultimately uncapturable zone of the decolonized fugitive. Denise Ferreira da Silva discusses blackness as antimatter, as negative life, that is, life that has negative value, and instrumentalized historically by Europe's universal reason in defining whiteness as its counterpart and the height of self-actualizing reason. So this is a position that's very critical of false European universalisms. From its negative use value to white reason and the dialectics of race, blackness, in Ferreira da Silva's deconstruction, opens onto indeterminacy, topologically connected to the infinite and uncontainable, approximated in infinity minus infinity by turning the ears, eyes, and fingernails of figures into corporeal portals into other worlds. This is accomplished through a kind of biopolitical montage in which bodily orifices and surfaces provide screens of layered videos within videos, revealing ever new scenes from what the artists call the racial Capitalocene, the geological epoch shaped by colonial capital, offering a more precise descriptor than the Anthropocene. Reverberating with Cuthand's reclamation as well as Black Quantum Futurism's chronopolitics, the video's performative documentary proposes something like an abolitionist double negative, both catalyzing one, a disidentification not only from white supremacy, but from the very logic of racial difference, and two, compelling the nullification of the very systems, the legal and economic institutions, the techno-social and educational infrastructure, the affective and aesthetic practices that have reproduced difference historically and into the present. So this is another model for what solidarity might look like beyond identity politics. It's only appropriate then that the Audlith group, in seeking to grant aesthetic form to this complex movement of a deeply historical futurism, find recourse in the imagery of two black holes colliding, creatively adopting a recent computer simulation from the California Institute of Technology that shows that awesome astronomical event detected for the first time ever by the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. Roughly 30 times the mass of the Sun, each black hole contains a gravitational singularity wherein space-time curves infinitely. The film operates, I argue, in the space-time between those two black holes after a past of unforgivable debt in what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, and facing a future filled with indeterminacy beyond reified difference. Its many portals reveal a not yet of radical disruption from a history that must be obliterated but never forgotten. At its best, speculative documentary unleashes cosmopolitical force and provides the building blocks, forms, events, affects, and poetics of new worlds. The challenge remains to organize the social movements to bring them into actuality. Thank you.
Thank you, TJ, for that illuminating talk. Before we dive into the discussion, a reminder, we are live via Igor Zabel YouTube channel and via Igor Zabel Facebook live stream. If you haven't OD'd on your multi-channels, register or sign in and we'll pass on your comments, questions to the speakers. Okay, and now back to Apollonia, Ade, and TJ. They're with me. We're together, though far apart, but together, separate together, and so on, as it is with these times. So, since TJ talked about futurisms, I would pass this on to Apollonia and Ade. So in your research, artistic, critical practices and strategies for building a community, do you see it as futurism? I guess my question is about the day after, how to translate, TJ also talked about transposing and translating, how to translate these practices and strategies into a universal practice or strategy. I've seen you show some reserve, how to transpose or transplant these practices elsewhere, but still, for me, they are a radical imaginary, and I'm thinking, is it a futurism? Apolonija?
Is it a futurism? Yeah. I guess I believe it is a futurism. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. I guess I believe that the way of working, as Ade was talking about, that's the way that shows that is kind of critical towards the production within the present capitalism. And that was also some kind of question that I was trying to ask yesterday, Alinka, when she was talking about the object. From my perspective, perspective of practicing artist, it's not the object that is of any interest, really, but it's rather the way of working, as Ade was pointing out. And that's for me also very important, not to produce just another critique in the frame that will be hanging on some gallery wall, but actually producing an experience with people that I care about, that I'm working with, that I meet through my projects as well, and become my cooperation partners, so to speak. And I also sort of keep long relation with. So I'm reserved to this idea of, it's very annoying to see myself, actually. I have to look somewhere else. Yeah, that's better. To look at you, it's better. I'm very eager to sort of keep the, I'm seeing myself when I talk. That's very annoying. Where I stopped is that, the production of object that I have a problem with, and that ends up within the art context on the art market anyway, and support the, just the same story further on. And then comes another critical subject, and then comes another critical subject, and then comes another object that represents it, and so on and so on. So that's something I get very tired of, actually. That's why I from, I guess, early on, reject to produce objects.
How do you see these practices and strategies expanding into the day after? So when the community work, the local community work is done, do we see this then encompassing other communities and so on? Is this a way of overcoming what TJ described as disbelonging? So the community work and care work becomes the binding of the universal?
Possibly. I guess as we can also experience already that the communities are, taking their sort of, how can I say, they get to work on their own further on through the experience that they have had. And I can see that they would have a certain influence and certain impact on the surrounding and the world as such. So there is a certain change in place, the change that maybe is a change of the benefit of the community or society as large, and not only, a group of people. Hard to say, hard question. Ade knows better, I think.
Ade, you yourself, you said like how to systematize this and like how to make it more systematic, all of these practices, community practices and artistic strategies and or how to make it into a more systemic proposition or implement it into policy, so to speak. So to go beyond the corrective, of globalization, just like a supplement that always kind of makes globalization more bearable, right? And I will couple that with a question from Christiana Erharter. So why do you think it is interesting to transfer your local practice and experiences to Kassel? Why is it interesting to you?
Mm-hmm. I think there should be a need I think there's a need of conversation in many places. Like and there's a lot of struggles, which is actually quite like cornered and some attempt rather than seeing it as a sad stories, but like I think we had enough of that. I think it's more interesting to see how people actually working. People are struggles. People are doing attempt speculate as well with a lot of models, with a lot of struggles, and that's rather than as like trying to find like one singular or universal dominate. That's a bit of really super problematic, because it seems there's always a dominating force or power behind these ideas of, if we think that there should be a universal ideas. I think we should think really radically into more like conversation or like mutual ecosystem, which is it also includes parasites, and that's for us, that's what we try to do. Like try to have a conversation with others, and that's one of the way that also not only about try to find like sort of like a fix. I don't know if it's going to be any exist of that, which is we always trying to do that, right? Like we're trying to categorize and like really into a certain definitive model, but maybe we should feel more vulnerable and seeing it more not as a definitive, but like really as something that exchangeable, open, and also have ability to deal with other system, also to deal with other models, and that's why for us it is interesting to see that connection, to see that conversation, how it can be like the hybrid, and then also the cut, and then like and also not only about collecting actually, or like the translating, because I believe there's going to be a lot of practice that's actually we cannot translate at all, like because it's also coming from our experience, like how to make. I mean, we started as an artist collective, and then people start to invite it as a curator, and then, how to exhibit ruangrupa, for example, like it's almost impossible. I think that's impossible in that format, because we have that exhibition, which is a reductionist that I'm saying before. I think the whole model is actually should be changed when the practice is also different. That's what we're trying to sort of crack as well. Maybe it's not translate. There's a lot of for sure there's a lot of things that is not translatable, and that's actually what we are really open also about Documenta project. You know, like some practices wouldn't have the need to be translated or like to be transformed into certain places. So again, it's also about the necessity, how it's actually also really become the needs, and then these two things can have a better conversation rather than our producers and artistic providers, you know, which is that always that kind of relation that has always happened in event or like exhibitions. Like, what about the needs of both sides? You know, like in a certain rooted locality. So. And it's many things are also related with the economic model of art event as well, and the art world. That's what we are also dealing with, a struggle with as well.
Okay. I will, for the argument's sake, I will describe Lambang as a sustainability and degrowth practice and strategy. How do you see that in Kassel? And the bigger question, how does this kind of become a part of Kassel so it sticks around even after the industry system, the art system or art industry has done its share of Documenta, and then, you know, what we leave behind, so to speak, the world after the world, the Lambang world after the Documenta world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually also really interesting. I think we'll see maybe the result not in the 2022. I think it will be interesting to see it after. I think the real thing will be after 2022, after the Documenta. That's how I think the mechanism will work by itself, and I think actually I cannot wait that it's actually after the 2022, because all the networks, all the platform buildings, all the mechanism that we started right now, like we struggle with, of course, with this zombie land situation right now, because there's a lot of time. There's a lot of time, and there is a lot of like building trust, you know, like through time. There is a lot of time element actually in the process, which a lot of infrastructure, a lot of system in the art world cannot afford, and that's how we try not to see the 2022 as a definitive compression of time, because that's always what we are thinking. Exhibition, right? I'm like, that's exhibition is always definite by a duration and space, right? What about if we don't see that way per se? You know, like it's actually a process that is growing.
Here's a question from Aleš Vaupotic. Could you comment on the curatorial concepts of the past Documentas in relation to your concept? Do you see it as a continuation of Adam Šimčík's basically decolonizing the Eurocentric universalism of, you know, of such events?
I will tell you a fun fact, because I've never been to Documenta. So I'm as innocent as yeah. We try to do research on that. So, but it's true. I think it's maybe it's from, maybe one can see that, but we really see it from the other end. Because that's why I started with like really, I mean, I can go on with how we started, but like it's not coming, it's not coming from anything else. It's like really coming from what we are doing. When we do a invitation back to Documenta, if they invite for us to send a proposal, but actually in our plan, we don't call it really a proposal, we call it a plan. In our plan is actually, we invite back Documenta if they want to be part of this process, because with or without Documenta, maybe scale-wise is different, but we really try to do it anyway. This is also part of what we are doing. So it's really not a theme, it's really not a subject. It's really like what we are practicing. It's really institutional practice rather than institutional critiques, I would say.
Yeah, knowledge production, indeed. Like after the so-called New Order era, you've basically set up a new society that had to follow the New Order. Sounds so Star Wars, but yeah, that's how it went. So ushering grassroots initiatives, local cultural production, alternative media, to provide outlets for the previously denied youth or countercultures and social movements. Christiane Erharte has a question for TJ. Universality from below is post-identity politics. I would like to hear more about this concept. Could you please elaborate about the concept of universality from below?
Sure, thank you. This is basically a concept that's developed in relationship to activist and organizing practice in my part of the world, and I think beyond, where lots of people are attempting to think beyond the conditions of racial and colonial capitalism, which has had such a destructive and catastrophic effect on social, political, economic, and environmental life that we're all living with today, which is also threatening the very conditions of livability in the future. So we're familiar with critiques of universality that see it as another form of, say, Euro-American hegemony or coloniality, and yet at the same time, there's a number of people increasingly thinking about how we can deal with this without collapsing into like a politics that's completely based on particularity, largely through identitarian concerns. And this is a big issue. There's an enormous, complex history about this. And we're also well aware that the dominant political and economic forms, political and economic elites have used divisive identitarian thinking and being in ways that have really been destructive to building modes of solidarity, for instance, between people within a multiracial working class formation. And this is also occurring within at a time when we know global capitalism is reaching extremes of economic, social, political inequality that are nearly unprecedented. And we've seen this in the context of the pandemic, within the States, within the tech industry in particular, where people like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Elon Musk, and others are making billions and billions of dollars. They've expanded their wealth in ways that are beyond grotesque. In a larger context where many people are losing their jobs, being evicted, without any health care, suffering, dying. And this is absolutely incredible. So how can we, in other words, face the bind of escaping from an endless type of antagonism that's directed on the basis of, say, identity or race or sexuality, within all the proliferating cultures that are also doing what they can to resist the ongoingness of oppression, and are being at the same time in some ways instrumentalized. Like we've seen this in the recent US election with Trump, how much his administration was trying to divide the opposition by inviting them to attack each other. And so when people begin talking about universality from below, this is an attempt to avoid the obvious pitfalls of a neo-colonialist universality, but at the same time try to imagine and represent and begin to practice forms of solidarity that cross difference, basically, that overcome the separations that have become so destructive in relationship to identitarian politics. With reference to people like Max Tomba and his recent book Insurgent Universality, and Assad Haider in his book Mistaken Identity, these are really useful and important texts, at least for me, and I think they resonate more broadly. They're deeply historical. They look at different geographies within the context of the unfolding of globalization, the long history of globalization, including many insurgent revolutionary struggles, for instance, attempting to correct the limited universality, for instance, of the French Revolution with the insurgent universality of the Haitian Revolution, which was radical precisely because it wasn't claiming that freedom was something that should only apply to this or that group, but was radical insofar as it was demanding that the freedom that was articulated within the French Revolutionary context, for instance, necessarily and had to also be relevant to those suffering from the histories of transatlantic slavery within the Caribbean. And so this was really crucial as a rallying cry within the Haitian revolutionary context. So how can we, in other words, develop modes of solidarity today in thinking beyond these kind of substantialist and also essentialist forms of universality that have existed up until this point? And when I'm proposing that we have to take seriously this notion of disbelonging or universality is necessarily empty center, this is a commitment to theorizing and also beginning to practice within, I'm thinking activist and organizing locally and regionally. How can we begin to think beyond the kind of essentialism of identity that has been, again, so limiting and debilitating in the past? So I think, for instance, as someone who's comes out of a historically situated white and masculinist perspective, these are, really in some ways dominant and privileged identities. How can we begin to think about an abolitionist politics that starts to attack and disavow the historical construction of whiteness in order to overcome that and practice a disbelonging from whiteness as a divisive and oppressive category, and at the same time begin to imagine modes of solidarity that can express the emergence of a multiracial political praxis. So that's very theoretical, I acknowledge, but I'm also interested in locating how this is being actualized, imagined, and put into practice by different artistic formations. And that was part of what I was trying to do in the talk. Anyway, I'll stop there. Hope that answered some of those questions.
Indeed it does. Yesterday I asked the question, could we situate or locate the universal subject or the universal? I guess we've found the location or the situation below. As you said, through a radical imaginary, we have concrete propositions of futurisms, but as you also ended your talk with, a question. The challenge remains how to organize the social movements to bring them into actuality. How? How to use another parallel, how to make all of these how to make the artistic system or these art critical, radical art research practices and strategies, how to make them spill over from the world of art into the world at large, you know? So not to have art as a corrective of politics, you know? Let's have art. It's good that we have art, political art, because at least our politics doesn't have to be political, you know? How to overcome that? How to make a futurism become a bureaucracy, you know, in a Slavoj Žižek kind of way, you know, a socialist bureaucracy. So you don't need to community organize and all of that, but the globe tackles the pandemic justly, rightfully, carefully, healthily, and so on. How?
Those are also really, you know, urgent and important questions. I think for me, on a certain level, we have to resist the tendency, first of all, to set up a binary between art and the world. I think that can happen, and indeed that accords to certain institutionalizations of art. But of course, we know that art as a space that's institutionalized in all sorts of ways is thoroughly enmeshed with politics and the economy. So I think it's crucial to resist that opposition and begin to think about how we can deinstitutionalize, perhaps, or exert critical pressure from within the context of institutionalization where it is right now. So that includes all things from exhibitions to museums and galleries, the art market, etc. And maybe we have to start, at least I believe, we have to begin thinking, as many people already are doing and have for a long time, that art isn't simply, or needs to be simply, a privileged, exclusive domain of thinking and practice. Rather, it can extend outward into all spheres, all areas of life itself. Art designates, in that sense, kind of collective creative act of living. And unless we succumb to producing, you know, small islands of emancipated practice here and there with no connection, at the same time that global capitalism has thoroughly created a worldwide hegemony, and we're all suffering within this condition, I think it's crucial to begin thinking about, again, this isn't a new thing, but we have to continue thinking about how we can connect these spaces and build up and scale up critical forms of practice in order to rethink the way we're living our lives collectively and indeed globally at all levels and within all sectors, so that we can challenge this fundamental logic of advanced capitalism, of racial and colonial capitalism that is being so destructive and indeed carrying our world towards a cascading of tipping points of catastrophe. And we're already seeing the impacts of this, but I think it's indeed crucial, especially within the worsening conditions of environmental and climate transformation, that we have to think about challenging this system that is indeed global at that level. That's not to say that local practices are not significant and important, but how can we work on solidifying these links and creating and building a mass movement that could challenge the political structures and economic structures that exist? So for me, this is partly an artistic challenge, but not only. I think it's more than crucial right now, especially as we're facing even these forms of alt-right emergent fascisms, that we have to begin to think collectively and put energy into actually organizing locally and regionally in order to build up the power, for instance, with emergent sites like the Progressive International, where we're challenging capital on its own terms.
Another question, can we hear more on how indigenous futurism is universal, how this is envisioned, and how it overcomes the particularism of its starting point? But maybe we've answered that already. I'll leave it up to you if you want to comment quickly on that.
Yeah, just quick, I'll comment quickly. I would refer to the practice of the Red Nation based in Albuquerque. It's an indigenous site of radical practice and thinking. One member of the Red Nation, Nick Estes, who I cite in my talk, explains explicitly that that decolonization has to be universal. And he says that partly for a strategic reason, because he's aware that indigenous people can't do it on their own. We need to think beyond simply the privileged subject of a political articulation, and this notion of insurgent universality helps us imagine why we're more powerful together than separately, and why we're more powerful when we think across difference, and we don't let difference completely prevent us from acting in common. That's not to say we're collapsing forms of particularity into the universal. We're not completely obliterating subjective and community-based histories and traditions, and that's extremely important, especially within the indigenous context. And Nick Estes and other indigenous thinkers make that apparent. But when Nick Estes says that decolonization must necessarily be universal, this is a new kind of politics that's recognizing again the global power of capital at this present moment, and a realization that we can't simply take this on within a strictly delimited local basis.
Another question for Apolonija, and I will tie this in with the question of art practices and strategies spilling over into bigger systems, social systems, state systems, and so on. Do you think community-based and led projects are threatened by the current pandemic because of the lack of physical contact, limitations in sharing close space? And how do you suppose the current situation will influence your work as well? Mute off.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I thought you have the power of muting and unmuting. Okay. It's in my hands. Well, yes, of course. Technically, it's a bit more difficult to navigate meeting people, getting together, and so on. But I believe that this should not stop us, but to find other ways. And of course, as we see, this is one of the ways as we are sitting here, myself in my studio, and I don't know, everyone else, everywhere else. I just hope we are not gonna continue forever like this. But on the other hand, this kind of moment of pandemic also makes the need for social encounter, I think, even bigger. So I can just imagine what is going to happen when this is over. It's going to be, bursting out in specific ways and maybe reinforced, and people will start to cherish the moments that they have together physically, meeting together much more than we did that before, perhaps. So no, I'm positive. I'm sure this is in some way going to continue. I'm actually working on projects related to specific communities, and I'm trying to navigate through Facebook groups and through meetings like this, but also with the quarantine statuses calculated within my calendar, let's say, such as this one now. One thing I wanted to mention in relation is that, yeah, I mean, talking about universality, for me, that is a very, maybe it's a bit disturbing word, because perhaps we are not looking for universal, but we are looking for ways to connect and share, rather than to produce some kind of universal rules or regulations or platforms that, I don't know. I mean, it's just, I'm trying to think about what it was just said by TJ about decolonization must be universal, and particularities has to be kept. And I think that's, of course, something that is very necessary to the smallest detail, in fact. But of course, the like in communities wise speaking, it is that we need to share the knowledge and experience that we have working on issues and projects that would be kind of, creating, let's say, better solutions to the systems that we have in place. Yeah, that's all, I guess, from me now. Did I answer the question?
To an extent.
Yeah.
We'll see after the pandemic. Ade, how is it to do community building during a pandemic via channels?
It's interesting actually to see how people actually care more in a more smaller units, because I think pandemic also teach us that it's even question the state, like really. I'm in Indonesia, and it's like 13,000 islands, 200 different languages. It's really a the pandemic, I think, teach us local smaller unit works better than a big like a centralistic even state. Government doesn't really work so much, and to some extent, for example, policy, because it really teaches us how the localities is like very ignored in many ways. Policy doesn't really work anymore, because like people just like initiate themselves, which is much working, caring each other, helping each other, and so on. It also teaches us how like we taking care of like the closest one, neighbors, families, friends, and also pandemic actually agree with Apolonija. It's also teaches how so far we actually really underestimate spending time together with people. we not really think about that. And then the pandemic, I think really, in the sense, quite interesting how it teaches us how we should do it together in a better way. There's a lot of initiative, which is very interesting, very small, and also very well connected. We changed our space also into like a small factories producing equipments and so on for the medics. Which we never really think before that it can be like that. But it's like this imagination. I think it's really popping up in many ways, also in different places, which is really super interesting. How people can really think more, taking care of more, and so on, and like thinking about resources as well, sharing, and so seeing a collapsing of like the big. Sort of dinosaurs, like home industry, for example, as street vendors is actually more survive rather than Starbucks, for example. Like malls are crumbling, but like a small market is actually happenings and really lively. So that's really interesting part of the this pandemic as well, and connected to the Lumbung or documenta, because Lumbung is actually also a system to deal with the crisis. So instead of we postpone, like thinking about postponing, we actually accelerating. So we accelerate a certain process. We know a lot of practices in different places, also struggles, and we accelerate that as well, the process, because that's what Lumbung is actually. Value is also about like dealing with the crisis, and then somehow pandemic really put us in the real crisis in a split second, like really in your face, and you really have. We are thinking like to do it actually a bit slower. But and then we think that we have to accelerate. Like it's not easy at all, but we try. Yeah.
Well, strengthening localities and communities, but let's see how sustainable that is. I see the capitalist techno-futurists as currently more sustainable in the long run. If this is a dress rehearsal for the systemic collapse or systems collapse that's yet to come. Yeah. I would use all of these localities and communities, but strengthen them even more, like make them more systematic, as you said, and systemic. Apolonija is over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on another thing that is related to the hermeticism of the art context or art world, if such a thing exists, and obviously it does, and a kind of way of trying to bring artists out in the world. I remember the talk many years ago, in fact, from Barbara Steveni APG group, and I'd like to remind you of they have been kind of placing people, artists in different, societal boards and corporations and so on. They have been doing this as a project. I think it was at the end of the 70s, and they have been stopped. They have been stopped by the art world itself, who was not taking that as art, and they were kind of losing all support from Art Council with the argument that this is not art. So I think that art itself and the system within art itself is very scared that art is suddenly going to disappear and will be somehow diluted in society if we are getting involved into this other, wider world, let's say. Thank you.
Yeah, no art object. How do we commodify that? How do we commodify that practice? Oh God, what do we do? What do we do? To extend the question, I think this is, just a second, Mothio Ramphili, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. How do we tangibly confront systems, economic, legal, etc., that restrict mobility across borders? That's part one. And part two, hence, our ability to act out disbelonging, establish new communities, or strengthen established relationships across borders. So, migration.
Sorry, that's a question for me?
I think for Apolonija, but yeah, I mean, it's open to all of you. Interlocute as at will.
Go ahead, Apolonija.
Right. Can you repeat the question, please, again?
So how do we tangibly confront systems, economic, legal, etc., that restrict mobility across borders in order to then act out disbelonging, establish new communities, or strengthen established relationships across borders? So no borders?
No borders, yeah. Well, I said already, I was talking about, language of nationality and language of locality. That is something to look into. And of course, it's gonna be quite difficult to erase the borders, but we can, I suppose, strengthen, as you said yourself already, communities within the borders, within confines of the national state itself. And those ones connect beyond the borders or ignore the borders and become perhaps then empowered by that, which I would understand then as what was talked about, universal. I don't have a specific recipe.
I might kick in here with this. So ask yourself, how strong are the UN? So what role do they play as an intergovernmental, planetary body? What role or how powerful or how successful the World Health Organization is? And I will extend this, as we have this trifecta, post-war trifecta, to the IMF, International Monetary Fund, set up to prevent economic disaster, to maybe cancel that, so there would be no social crisis, hence right-wing insurgencies, etc., as we can learn from the historical textbooks. So what role do these bodies have today? And then we might maybe begin to see the systemic, where to grapple with the systemic change. But TJ, yes. How do we tangibly confront systems that restrict mobility across borders?
Well, this is an urgent question right now within many parts of the world, but especially in the States, because we've been dealing with this over the last few, presidential administrations. So the border politics in the States had become really intensified with militarization, technology, and forms of xenophobia that are again part of the kind of white supremacist identity politics that the recent government has practiced, but also the recent administration. But also before that, it was in place during previous presidential administrations as well. So, I mean, I support a no borders policies. That's quite radical in the States. I think we have to look at the extremely complex historical causes of why we're seeing the kinds of migrations that we have been recently. And if you look at the longstanding directions of U.S. foreign policy within, for instance, Central America, you see that this is part of an ongoing colonial enterprise to dominate the political and economic systems for the benefit of US political and economic elites. And that's destroyed livelihoods and economic systems and political integrity in those parts of the world. So when we see waves of central migration moving northward and being met with militarized violence on the southern border of the US in these extremely violent and racist, xenophobic attacks on asylum seekers, and when we see families being brutally separated by border police and the military system within the States, we have to think about how the U.S. as a regionally dominant superpower has effectively brought into it's really caused some of the motivations for that migration in the first place. So I think we have when we're confronting the powers that solidify in borders, we have to look at the historical causes and what interests they've served. But you know, in terms of disrupting them, we're still extremely subjected to the conditions of a kind of neoliberalism. So even though Trump has lost this most recent election, although he continues to contest it, which is incredible, we face an incoming administration that provides little hope for many of us on the left. So I think, again, we're faced with the central challenge of how do we rebuild our mass movements, organizing, and how do we reconstitute our political structures so that we can challenge the terms of an extremely weakened form of democratic practice, which doesn't really offer much in terms of the voting system or the meaningful transformations of power. And I think this could be extended to large-scale transnational institutions like the UN and the IMF and the World Bank, et cetera. These are basically largely instruments of neoliberalism that are dominated by developed countries, by the G8, particularly in the case of the UN. And they have no teeth other than to advance the economics of structural adjustment all over the world. So we're really at an extremely weak point. And I think for me, as speaking as a member of DSA, which is the largest socialist organization in the States, we have to reconstitute our politics by building collective power. And that has to be done within the electoral system and also beyond it. So that when we, for instance, in our communities, deliver mutual aid to disenfranchised migrants who have suffered the loss of their livelihoods, of their communities, have migrated, have gotten through border security, and are now living in states of precarity. This is another example of seeing a profound need within the circumstances of desperation and overcoming our own limited community formations and enacting that mode of disbelonging and reaching out to others and delivering mutual aid. And that's the beginning of a kind of multiracial movement of building collective power that can establish the terms of trust and accountability within relationships. to rebuild political systems. And I think it can only really begin there, because the other conditions of larger scale national and international politics are so thoroughly corrupted by corporate power and nepotism and money that we really have to start from that position and then scale up. So I know that this is extremely difficult, but I see no other way. And just one last thing, we have to, you raised the situation of techno-futurisms. And I think within the context of the pandemic, we're faced with the situation of how our media of connectivity, like how we're interacting right now, is also thoroughly provided for and dominated by a capitalist tech industry. So I think it's newly important to begin thinking about how we can decommodify our instruments of communication and build forms of social media and instruments of connectivity that are not ruled by ultimately a for-profit capitalist logic. So how can we do that? That's an enormous question too. I see projects like Jonas Stahl's attempt to collectivize Facebook, for instance. This is a start. This is a beginning. So I'd like to see more of that.
Right. To round off, there's another question. If we are really talking about practices of solidarity, commonality based in situations and struggles, why use the language of universal? TJ, do you want to quickly respond, or?
Well, again, it's not that people are like all people who are dedicated to radical organizing and activism are theorizing universality. Rather, it's a few points of articulation that I find really thoughtful and convincing. Ultimately, I strongly recommend, for instance, the book Mistaken Identity by Assad Haider, who's addressing the fact that, at least in the States, and I think to some degree in Europe, the formations of identity politics are making it so that we can't effectively challenge dominant power. Because when we have these communities distributed into small categories, for instance, of queer people or Black folks or indigenous folks, all struggling for their little box of rights, this is doing the work of dominant economic and political power in dividing anything that would otherwise challenge it. So we really quite urgently need to think beyond these systems of division and see how we can emerge together in a struggle for the commons, ultimately, that is a meaningful challenge to constituted power. So there's part of it that is indeed theoretical and maybe academic, but this really informs some of the challenges of actual politics on the ground these days. So as we continue to see, for instance, working class white interests divided off from immigrant interests within a politics of xenophobia and anti-migration, instead of the formation of a multiracial working class opposition, right? This is an enormous problem for us. And so the language of universality, even though I totally acknowledge, and the most critical voices do as well, that it has the potential for a kind of neo-colonialism of effect, can otherwise provide some really useful language about that can help enable our activism and organizing within artistic practice and without. So really to see the full accounting of how this is meaningful and how it might be done, I highly recommend that book, Mistaken Identity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, universality goes beyond commonality. It's not just a sum of commonalities. It's a function, as Alenka Zupancic stated yesterday. It extends the right to have rights, the right to have care, the right to have justice, the right to the city, the right to the environment, the right to the planet, actually. Do we have much in common with animals or maybe robots in the near future? What are those rights? Universalism as a function. Thank you very much, Apolonija Šušteršič, Ade Darmawan, and TJ Demos. Thank you for your illuminating, insightful talks, and thank you for this discussion. Just to quickly announce that at 8 p.m. Central European Time, what follows is the award ceremony. The Igor Zabel Award for Culture and Theory acknowledges exceptional achievements of curators, art historians, theorists, art writers, and critics whose work supports, develops, or investigates visual art and culture in Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. With the presentation will be with the laureate, Zdenka Badovinac, presented by Anthony Gardner, art historian and jury member. So stick around for that. That's at 8 p.m. Central European Time. This has been day 2 and the closing day of the Igor Zabel Award 2020 International Conference under the banner The Entire World as Our World. A big, big thank you again to all our speakers, TJ Demos, Boris Grojs, Ade Darmawan of Ruangrupa, Apolonija Šušteršič, Alberto Toscano, and Alenka Zupančić. Thank you for watching and participating with comments and questions. Whether it's the entire world or our world, whether it's the entire world as our world, the world is not enough. Until next time, keep safe and take care.